Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this class today. My name is Cristian Acosta, Agriculture Educator from Cornell Cooperative Extension, and I'm happy to be with all of you today, starting this week. And before starting, remember, so if you have any questions, feel free to unmute the microphone and ask, or in the chat, you can ask anytime. And that's it. So let's start. It's 11:01, so we're good to start. So this class it's composting for the winter. So we're gonna be learning about what is the difference with normal regular composting during the summer, for example, the difference with composting for now the winter. So we're gonna be learning how to use our current compost that probably if you have been doing your own compost, so now probably is the time, it depends how long it has been. You can start using your compost, how to use it, the best materials and the layering techniques for keep the compost active during the winter. The best ways to start a new compost pile in the winter, because it's there are a couple differences, and the effective layering techniques, and also odor control and pest prevention for your compost pile or compost bin. So why to be composting during the winter? So that's a question about like, well, it's freezing outside, so probably it's not that easy to be composting, right? So one of the reasons is because we can keep doing it all year round. We just need to pay attention to a couple details, but it's possible to keep composting all year round. So we can keep producing this nutrient-rich compost for the spring. So when spring comes, you have some compost ready for the new plants, the new gardening season. And also because during the winter months, we can also help to reduce the landfill waste, right? And also attract beneficial organisms to your winter garden. So there are a couple more reasons. So each one you decide, even if it's just to keep doing something during the winter, because unfortunately we cannot be growing anything outside, probably some herbs, but eh, other than that, if you are a passionate gardener, so this time of the year is like a little boring because there's not a lot to do. So composting is one of those activities to keep doing. So another reason to be composting this season. So a quick refresher about composting, because here we are not starting from scratch and just how to start a compost pile and everything. Yeah, normally, like for the growing season during the summer, during the warm time of the year. Uh, so in that case, just quickly, we are composting a pile with organic matter because we need a lot of microorganisms there that usually is bacteria and fungi decomposing our organic matter. So we throw a lot of stuff there that is organic, again, um, kitchen scraps, leaves, the remains like from your garden, of course, something that is healthy, not the plants that are full of botrytis and mildew and a lot of like the plants that they are dead because of the pathogens, the bacteria or the fungi. So no, those ones no. Something that is healthy, and we throw in this pile, and then we allow these wonderful microorganisms to keep working so hard in there to transform something like that just into a rich compost, like a soil texture substrate that we can use to feed our plants later. So we are doing this in presence of oxygen, right? So we need oxygen for that aerobic decomposition. So because if we cover everything completely sealed, there are a couple methods, but no, it's not composting exactly. It's just to produce different natural It can be like, for example, bokashi that is liquid. It's a liquid that is fermenting, and couple natural fertilizers, but in that case, we don't need that one. We need oxygen for that bacteria and that fungi. So in that way, we are just breaking down the organic matter into tiny, small pieces that then our plants can easily get the nutrients from the pile. So that's just a quick refresher about composting. That's in general, that's composting, just decomposing a lot of organic matter out there. So, how to use your current compost, especially if you are a beginner composter and now you have compost, probably you have a compost pile, a compost bin, or even the rotatory one, and it's like, no idea how to use it now. What is the proportion? How do I know that it's ready or not? Probably if some of you are experienced with composting, you know all of this. So just like I said, a quick refresher about using your compost. The one that you started before is about color. Something like this in this picture, you can see that it's like soil. It's like the potting mix, that texture that is very, very similar to soil, to a potting mix, something that you can touch and it's not gross to touch because even the smell. But right now we're talking about color. It's just dark. It's almost like dark or black. Um, like I mentioned, is similar to soil. So that nice soil that sometimes you are preparing the garden and it's black, almost black. So that means it's full of organic matter. And sometimes you can see some lighter material, some material that is still in there, in progress. So if most of that material is chunky and you still can see a lot of the pieces of celery and carrots and fruits and wood or whatever you are composting, so in that case it's not ready yet, even if it's getting there with that texture in that color, but still you see a lot of material that is not decomposed. So in that case, also the texture helps. Just touching the compost and just using your hands. It's not really gross to do it because at that point, even the smell is not strong. So if you can open your compost bin or the compost pile and the smell is not like rotten or anything like that, it's just like soil. Is also kind of nice to smell that is fresh. It's um, not like I say, it's nothing that makes you like nauseous or anything like that. If something like that happens, like it smells like sulfur or like rotten eggs, or like you feel like nausea just to smelling that, in that case, probably it's because excess of water or a lot of greens. We're going to be talking about the greens and browns for the compost pile. And especially ammonia. So when there is a lot of nitrogen and the greens, the proportion or not enough air. So that's why we need air, we need oxygen. So in that case, instead of decomposing normally with an aerobic composting, we are just fermenting that one. So in that case, the smell is terrible. Uh, the good compost is nothing like that. It smells like earthy. It's like when you literally open a potting mix, potting soil, even from the store or just from your garden, something that smells organic, but it's nice. So just with the texture, the smell, the color, you can tell when it's ready or when it's not ready. Something nice to do is sifting. So that in that way you can make your own one or buy one, but it's really easy to make one just with um, some pieces of wood and fencing or anything metallic that you can find, and start doing this process like in this picture we can see. So just sifting. Um, the compost. So in that way, the bigger pieces like I mentioned, pieces of celery, onions, or whatever is in there, uh, that they are still in the process of composting. You can take that one back to the pile or back to the composter and just use what is ready, what is already um, finished, the compost that is finished and ready to use. So that's a simple method, and it's good also just to keep your compost clean. And when you're applying to the plants in the garden, you have just pieces of peels or anything that can attract animals, especially wildlife. That's why we need to pay attention to the bigger pieces, especially with food, right? So how to be using our compost. So now we are taking that out of the compost pile, preparing that one. Just now you have the bag or the bucket or your compost that is ready, but how to use it. So in general advice is that for new beds, if you have rice beds, in that case, mix the compost to the top of the rice bed. In that case, about 6 to 12 inches, no more than that. Some people they put a lot of the compost, like almost half of the bed, or more than that when it's not necessary. Especially because we are growing mostly what vegetables, flowers, herbs, so we don't really need that deep. So in that case, just 6 to 12 inches that it's um, where the roots are going to be growing and taking the nutrients from the soil. So we can be using that one. And for established, this is for the new ones. And for the ones that they are established, we use just on the surface, just on the surface, um, applying like a thin layer of compost. You don't need a lot, and just allow rain or when you're watering, rain, sun, and just the natural process to be mixing that compost with the soil. Or if you want to do it by hand, you can do it. But what I mean is that when they are established, you don't need really a lot of compost. Another method that is not here in this slide is that when you have just a little bit of compost, because that happens often, especially when you start, the advice is start small, right? So we can start with a small pile of compost or just a tiny composter at home, a compost bin, because we can do it indoors too. But these ones are tiny. So you have just a little bit of compost. It's not enough even just to keep a layer of the compost on top of the rice bed. So what to do in that case when you have just a little bit? So in that case, when you have just a little bit of compost, when you just keep the compost. You're not applying that one right now, unless you know what are the spots where you're gonna be placing your plants next year. So you can keep it and do it in the spring or doing it right now, and it's about opening a little hole like when you are transplanting your seedlings from the nursery home, or if you're growing those ones indoors, uh, opening with a shuffle, just with by hand, etc., opening the hole and then throwing a little bit of the compost there, just the bottom of that hole where the plant is gonna be there on top. Next spring, right? For the next season. So in that case, only the bottom of the plant is going to have that compost there available for just that plant. And you can be doing that. That's how you can use wisely your compost if you have just a small amount. Now, what about pots? Because some of us, and I include myself in this one, we also grow the plants and we use the compost indoors, so with the pots, or even outdoors, but still with pots. So in that case, how to do that? So when you're potting and preparing your potting mix or your mix for the plants. In that case, you can combine the compost with the potting soil in a 1/3, 1 to 3 in ratio, where is 1 part of compost and 3 parts of soil. That can be potting mix or the soil from your garden, or if you're doing your own mix with perlite and moss or with a different substrates, you can incorporate the compost in just one part of compost and three parts of your substrate. And that's like that. Is that simple? You don't need, like you can see, you don't need tons of compost um, to feed the plants. And this also allows you to be using even more um, the compost in more plants or more areas of your garden. And if you have your plants, so you're not repotting, it's not like changing or planting the new seedlings. In that case, when for the plants that they are already established and they are in pots, you can just add like a thin layer of the about half inch of the compost on the surface. And even not, you don't need to be mixing because sometimes we can easily break the roots of the plants doing that because it's just a small pot, or even if it's a bigger pot, but the roots are everywhere. So just like when you're mulching, that's the best term. When like mulching, in this case, is not mulch, but it's compost. You just put around the plant, put it there around the plant, about half inch, and that's it. When you're watering the plants, then the roots are going to start taking those nutrients, and this is that simple. So in that case, you can be using it in that way. Now, you're using your compost, your current compost, and now you want to start the new pile during the winter. So it's still the same concept for the previous compost, like summer composting. It's the same principle. You need a ratio of greens and browns. So what is greens? Is anything any organic matter that is green or similar to green is fresh. That's the word when they are fresh. Um, so like the food scraps, anything vegetables, like you can see here in this picture. So anything that when you're cooking, uh, all that um, vegetable peels and coffee grounds. Coffee grounds, there is a debate, talk, a discussion about that one, uh, because about 5% you can be adding 5% to the compost pile. Some people they are like, no, I'm not adding coffee grounds, and it depends. So sometimes coffee grounds in like when it's a lot of that um, in compost piles, sometimes not always, but sometimes it repels like the plants like a natural, not, I don't want to say herbicide because it's not like it kills the plant, but sometimes it prevents some plants to be growing. But it's mostly, especially the fresh coffee, the coffee ground. There is a chemical compound in the fresh coffee grounds. So that's why it's still like some people prefer do not incorporate those ones, or some people say if you, when I say people, it's research, like research based. Some projects, some experiments is like, okay, they are saying um, use coffee grounds, but no more than 5% of the coffee grounds, or yeah, you can use coffee grounds. So it's in that case you can read a little bit more of that and make the decision if incorporating coffee grounds or not. Personally, I don't do it. I don't incorporate in my compost. And for greens, I use like fruit vegetables, the peels, and everything that it hasn't been cooked. And that's something that I want to mention too. Even for salads, sometimes salads, they are not cooked, right? So it's just the lettuce, the tomato, and cucumbers, and well, many things, the herbs that you can incorporate to your salad. But then we add some dressing, right? Salad dressing. So uh, in that moment, it's like that even when it's not cooked, we cannot use that the salad, the scraps from the salad. Because many of these salad dressing, it has oil, it has some different texture, not different compounds, especially oil, something that we don't want to incorporate to our compost pile. Any fat or oil, and it's like, no, that's a no for the compost pile. Also, green leaves when we are mowing the yard, when we are pruning, anything that is healthy, that is not full, like I mentioned before, is not full of diseases, we can incorporate that to the compost pile as a green. Cover crops like the winter rye, clover, uh, like anything fresh, even the manure. So manure when it's well rotted. And I wanted to show this picture here. So this is like the manure that you want to use for your compost pile, not the one that is just fresh there and that even it smells a lot, just there where you have your cows or your horses. The fresh one, no, is that one. Just allow that to be decomposing, and when it's well rotted, you can incorporate that to the compost pile. Um, and the browns, so we need some brown material too, and it's everything like the name it's telling us, anything brown. So wood, when you're processing wood and you have wood chips, something like this. Straw, with the straw, you have to be careful. So same like when I was talking about coffee grounds, some people say like, no, I prefer not to add the straw or hay because of the seeds. So sometimes you can have seeds and then you have a lot of weeds in your compost pile. So that's mostly the reason. But if you know the quality and you know that it's not full of weeds and there is not that risk or the risk is low, so in that case you can incorporate, because we, especially for the winter, we can be using straw or hay. We can be using that to protect our compost pile. Now, shredded paper and cardboard. You can add that one, but when it's just something like this picture, like you can see here, nothing is like no stickers, no coating or the ink, anything printed on the surface of the cardboard. Sometimes if you order stuff online, you can get that kind of cardboards that no printing, nothing, probably just a stamp. But that's it, something that you can remove and use the cardboard. But other than that, if it has some coating or ink, a lot of stuff printed in there, it's better not to use that one. Sometimes that chemical compounds from the ink and the coating and protecting the even like wax to protect the box, that's not good for our compost pile. So in that case, that's the only exception when you don't have any printing or anything like that. Wood chips, like I said, that's fine, that works, with the exception of black walnut. Why not to use it? Another discussion about that is that some people say, no, it doesn't matter because when it's already chipped and exposed to the air, and after a time, the euglone, that is the chemical compound in the black walnut, it's gone. So we can use that. And some research say like, no, you still have that risk to have that euglone in there. And the euglone is like a natural herbicide. So if you incorporate that to your compost pile and then using the compost to your garden, it's like applying herbicide to your garden. So probably some plants, some seedlings, they cannot do well, and it's not really that nice. Yeah, so there is some risk about that. So it's better just to avoid black walnut. Um, and sawdust in moderation, so you can use it because yeah, we're incorporating also the um, fine material, and that's nice. So the ratio, there is also a discussion about greens and browns. So 50% or 80% browns and just 20% greens, or 75% browns and 25% greens. Um, so yes, I have done both, 50% greens, 50% browns, and still having good compost, doing 80% browns and 20% greens and still having good compost. With the 80-20, so always more browns than greens, we don't have the risk of having alcohol. What's the term? I just forgot the term. Anaerobic decomposition. So when there is no oxygen. So when we have a lot of greens, so a lot of ammonia, nitrogen, ammonia, uh, we lower that risk to have just some fermentation, because the fermentation, the product is that alcohol, right? That is that smell when you open the compost pile, and it's just like, no, it smells rotten, like rotted. It's not that nice. Applying browns, like with a higher amount of a higher ratio of browns, so you reduce that risk. So you can even go higher in browns, 90% even, and just 10% of greens, and you can have good compost, but not when you have more greens than browns. So there are some winter. What time? Okay, we still have some time. Um, some techniques for the composting during the winter. So in that case, when it's the summer, so we can place our compost pile wherever you want to put it. So we can start anywhere. For the winter, so we need to pay attention about location and a couple methods, techniques. So because, for example, location, you need to keep the compost pile or the compost bin um, in a place protected from the strong, harsh winds and a lot of moisture. So if it's just exposed there and having a lot of the rain and snow, especially in the last couple of years that we have winters, that it's just a constant process of um, freezing and thawing, freezing and thawing. One day can be 7 inches of snow, and 2 days later it's all melted. So in that case, we need to prevent or protect our compost pile, especially if it's a pile just out there, protect it from that. A lot of moisture. Insulation, because we need to keep a little warm that pile. And that's something that I want to mention here is that the speed of the composting process is going to be slower during the winter than summer or spring or summer. So we need to keep that bacteria and fungi alive, right? So in that case, we need to protect the core of the compost pile. So we need some insulation, like I mentioned before, just with the straw or hay, even compost and blankets. You can use fabric, anything to protect the compost pile. Not plastic, because with plastic, and especially if it's a sunny day, we can increase too much the temperature inside. So that's something that we don't want. Even if it's freezing outside, but it's also about oxygen, right? We need oxygen. So if we cover totally completely with plastic, we can have that problem with the oxygen and having fermentation. So we don't want that. Just with straw, you can cover your compost and protect it's like a natural blanket to protect the compost pile. Now, what about before going to layering, what about if you have a compost bin or even composting in buckets? So in that case, you can use the fabric or something to put on top of the compost bin, or just placing that compost bucket or compost bin, even the rotatory ones, in a sunny area. So because usually these ones are plastic, right? The material of the compost bin is like a thick plastic. So if we place that one in a sunny area, that's gonna keep a little bit warm inside and keep that temperature inside. So that's one method, one technique that you can use for that, for those compost bins and compost bins. And for the piles, so just cover your compost pile to prevent the excess moisture and the wind. And layering. So I use this picture here again to show you on the layering. So it's just like making a lasagna, like I mentioned here. So you can you add a layer of greens and then browns and then greens and browns. So during the fall, this is easy to do because we have tons of browns, a lot of leaves that they naturally fall down. So we can use those ones, even mow on top of the leaves and then all that to the compost pile for brown material. So we have a lot of brown material. But when you don't have brown material, especially when you're composting indoors and you don't have that brown material, you can use potting mix or just soil from the garden. Of course, soil from the garden is way cheaper than just using potting mix, also because just using fresh potting mix just for composting, it's expensive and is not the best advice, right? So something brown, even if it's just soil, you can be like a sandwich or like a lasagna layering greens and browns, greens and browns, greens and browns. That's the key, even during the summer, the layering. Um, that's why even if you have one of these small composters at home, like for the kitchen, that they are small, not too big, and the problem with these ones is that you keep adding kitchen scraps, right? And then you open that and it's just like a goop media with bacteria and it's just terrible. The smell is terrible and it's because there is nothing really brown. So you are adding only greens, 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 that ammonia bacteria. So that is just fermenting instead of being having a nice compost. So adding something brown, even just soil, that helps. And of course, we need to move our compost pile because normally we learn that we need to be moving the compost, right? We are layering, and then after a couple days or weeks, we are moving the compost pile. These ones that they are rotatory, so you can easily just move that handle and keep rotating the compost. But what about during the winter? So during the winter, we still need moisture and we need to keep moving the compost pile, but not a lot. So do it way less frequent than during the summer or the warmer days. Because like I mentioned before, we need to keep that bacteria and that bacteria and fungi, the microorganisms, we need to keep them alive. If we start moving and turning a lot, so we are exposing them just to the freezing temperatures and they can easily die or just um, go really, really slow, like even slower because we have slow composting during this winter, but even slower. So in that case, we need to do it less frequent. So um, only if it's necessary that you can see that the compost is just like getting pile, like heavy, and it's not that easy even just with the hand if you want to touch it, and it's not that easy to take one piece of the compost because it's just like piling and getting heavy stuck in there. So you can just with a fork, like in this picture, you can just move it a little bit, not turning a lot, just moving a little bit, or with a compost aerator that is something like this. You can get these ones online if you want. And it's just like a thick wire that you use. Same concept with the wine opener. Just go around there and move in a little bit just to give some air to the compost pile, and that's it. You don't need to be turning a lot the compost pile. It's more for the air, just to incorporate some air in there. And the moisture, not a lot of, like I mentioned, not leaving the compost there exposed to water and rain and thawing and freezing and thawing and freezing. Because in that case, we also can have some problems when it's too wet. We know, even during the summer, right? So in that case, we can protect our compost pile or the bins, the compost bin. And if it's too dry, because that also happens, it can be dry, we can water, especially for the plastic ones, the compost bin. Because it doesn't mean that because it's winter, it's gonna be okay. So no, it's still, you still need to be watering or keeping the compost moist but not soaking wet. So even you can take with your hand the compost and then squeeze like a sponge. So if it's just dripping a lot of water, it's too wet. If nothing comes out, so it can be too dry. So just that you squeeze hard and just probably one, two, or couple drops, that is ideal. So um, in that way, you know if you need to be adding water or if it's too wet or too moist, um, and you need just to do something about and that protecting your compost. Now, if you're starting a new pile, so how to do that? So, um, of course, the best time to start is early winter. So right now, you can even start a new pile right now, uh, with ideally with a composter. With this can be composter that you buy. Some of these ones are a little pricey. There are some, well, sometimes there are some companies that they are offering these ones and donating these ones. We haven't had that in a while. Um, but it's nice when some companies they want to donate the composters, and it's nice to have that one because usually they are pricey. Well, when you're buying just first time because they can last for many years. So at the end, doing the math is not that expensive, but initially it can be a little pricey. So we can use something like this, or we can use just a bucket. So this is an example that we have tried even with master gardeners, and then during the classes about composting, and it's just with a bucket. So just a 5 gallon bucket and drilling some holes on top for the air, and on the bottom also around here in the this doesn't well, here in the bottom of this bucket, and drilling some holes, not too big. Just imagine that if a worm, just a soil worm, what to go in there. So they can go in there, but not a rat or a mouse or a bolt or any other animal. So just for the ones that we want in the compost pile. And just with a bucket and same method, greens and browns. In a ratio, it can be 50-50% or 80% brown material, 20% green material. And with the lid, and the lid has some holes in it, so we have air, and you can be moving the compost and every now and then, and that's that simple, that easy. We can start doing the compost. Of course, is you need a lot of, well, not a lot, but couple buckets because you'll realize that you can fill that bucket really quick, but it works even just with a bucket, and it's not that expensive just to get some buckets. So you start right now, like early winter, or even before, like during the fall, and before the ground freezes. And like I always mention, especially if you're new in composting, start small. So the bucket can be a good idea because it's small, it's cheaper. So if you like that, you can start doing more or even going for a bigger composter. Um, And like I mentioned, the key is the greens and browns from the start, from day one. And like I mentioned before about new pile or new compost, place those ones in a sunny area during the winter. So that's gonna help to keep that heat inside. So now hot versus cold composting. So with the hot composting, so especially during the summer, spring, summer, even fall, we have all those microorganisms working a lot. They are happy eating and decomposing that organic matter, so it's active and it's really quick. You can have um, compost just in couple months, just really quick. For the cold composting, it's slower. So for example, you can start a compost pile now and it can be ready in couple months. So like I mentioned before, you can start now and have some compost for the spring. Um, and you can see the difference, of course, when you're doing it during the summer, especially if you put, even you keep the advice about placing the compost pile or bin in a sunny area, is like going fast, like crazy. In that case, you need to be careful about your compost not catching fire. So that's a risk at some point when it's too hot. So we don't want that. We don't want the volcano composting, right? And the cold composting, so we don't have that risk. It's slow, so we need that heat, uh, less turning, and it's a little longer. But if you pay attention to what I have been telling you, you don't have something like this. So this is not the best practice because yeah, it's a compost pile and it's there, but it's really messy. There is not the respecting the layering, not protected by anything really. Um, so in that case, it's gonna be even slower. You can easily attract wildlife, animals coming to your compost pile. A lot of pests. We don't have insects in that time of the year, but we have wildlife. So that's why something like this doesn't really work. So this is an example of what not to do. And so the key is about protecting your compost pile, also to avoid raccoons and a lot of animals in your compost on top of your compost pile, keeping the temperature and the materials, the ratio uh, browns and greens, and you can have compost. It doesn't matter if it's hot composting or cold composting. So which one is better for the winter? So compost bin, compost pile, which one? So in that case, we have all of them, they work. So that's in general, all of them work. So don't feel like, oh no, I have a pile, so it's not gonna work. No, it's gonna work. So in that case, if you have just the pile, compost pile, it's gonna be slower, and your homework, your what you need to do is cover the compost pile with fabric or with the hay or um, straw, uh, just protecting your compost and the surface of the pile. That's it. So in that case, it's gonna be a little slower because it is directly exposed to the wind and to the freezing temperatures. But it works. Slower, but it works. Now the compost bin. So in that case, a bin, um, it's nice for small places. For example, the bucket method. It works when you have just a small space, probably front in the front yard or the backyard, but just a small space. So a compost bin, it's good. In that case, what like I mentioned a couple times before, place that one in a sunny area. And you can even also add some insulation around it. If it's not possible to keep that one in a sunny area, you can add some thick material, even if you have some memory foam that you are not using, or anything that you can put around the compost bin, just to keep helping keeping the heat inside. So that works. Adding some insulation around it. But again, be careful about covering completely and insulating completely the compost bin because we need air. So we still need some air. And that those microorganisms, they still need some air. If not, you have just fermenting some alcohol in there. So it's not gonna be nice. Um, or the rotating compost bin. So this is a picture. This is my picture, one that I have, and it's a small one. It's a rotatory one, but it's small. It was like less than $50, so you can imagine how big it is. It's just a small one. So in that case, both of them you can see that they have it's that black plastic and that helps to keep the temperature in there. But if it's too cold, it's below 32 degrees, In that case, we will need to protect and put something on top, like that insulation for the compost bin, because in that case, it's above the soil, so it's still exposed to the freezing temperatures, and especially because it's small. When you have the bigger ones, so there is some protection because of the amount of compost that you have in there. But when you have these small ones, uh, they can be easily exposed to these freezing temperatures, and in that case, it's gonna be slow. Same like with the compost pile, it's gonna be slower. And you don't need to be turning often, like I mentioned before. For indoor composting, that's easy because you don't need really to protect anything. You can do it in a basement, a garage, or any area that you have, because you don't need, in that case, you don't need direct sunlight. Of course, indoors, the garage or the basement is not too cold. It's not exposed to freezing temperatures, even if you don't have any heat going in there. It's not going to be too cold. So in that case, um, of course, when you have indoor composting, you're using any of these, right? A compost bin, a bucket, or the rotatory one. Um, yeah, because especially the odors, the smells, is hard to say that you can have a compost pile in your garage or your basement. And it works the same. So just keep in mind the ratio, browns and greens, and that will work. And for all of them, so like I mentioned before, the ratio of browns and greens, and also even it doesn't matter if it's the hot composting during the summer. If you chop the material, for example, the eggs shells, not putting the eggshell completely in there, like the whole thing, just smashing those ones or chopping in small pieces is going to be way faster than throwing just the whole orange or the whole apple or bigger pieces. So the smaller they are, the faster they are gonna be decomposed. So that's the key, to keep doing it faster. Um, Not like this. So here is another example what not to do ideally, not to do, especially during the winter, because it's gonna take months, even during the summer and the warmer time of the year, it's gonna take a lot for these pumpkins and that big, those, for example, these canes, like from the corn canes, and bigger pieces, even sunflowers or plants, just throwing the plants in there, it's gonna take a lot for those ones to decompose. Um, so keep that in mind. If you can just cut those ones, chop those ones in smaller pieces. And if you have some problems with the composting, like odor, so when it smells terrible, in that case, mostly, sometimes, even most of the time, it's about the ratio, the greens and browns. So not respecting the balance, the ratio between 20% or 20%, 20 to 25% of greens, and browns about 75 to 80%, or even just 50 and 50%. But like I mentioned before, just it's better keeping more browns than green. And for pest prevention, this is a good way. So even if you have some animals trying to come in here, well, with the exception of rats or voles or small rodents, they still can go into this compost that we can see in this picture. But bigger animals, they cannot really go in there. So in that case, just to avoid wildlife and avoid pests, just protect your compost pile, especially if you're incorporating kitchen scraps, any food, so that easily attracts the animals. When you have a lot of water in there, so excess moisture, you can cover the pile during the heavy rain or snow, heavy snow, especially like I mentioned before, the thawing and freezing cycles, and you can add more browns. So you can go for more and more browns. It's gonna be a little slower, but it's not gonna cause the fermenting effect when you have a lot of moisture in there. And like I mentioned before, protecting your compost bin or compost pile to avoid the frozen compost. And if it's frozen, so you can insulate the pile, not adding a lot of water or especially cold water. So you can just carefully, like here I say, carefully add some warm water, not hot, not very hot water, just warm water, because remember, we want to keep those microorganisms alive, so not hot water, just warm, and keep it the insulation in the compost bin or the compost pile. And if it's going too slow, even for the winter, it's just too slow. Like you can see that it's not really decomposing, it's not happening anything after 1 month or 1.5, and nothing is going on. It can be because now we have a lot of browns, like I mentioned, it's gonna be slower. Um, so you can add a little more greens, peels, coffee grounds, anything from the kitchen, any green material, fresh material, and check the moisture levels, because when it's too dry, when it's excess moisture, we have problems. And when it's too dry, also we have problems, because in that case, those microorganisms, they also need some moisture, some water. So like I mentioned before, just squeezing, and that's the way that you know if it's too wet or too dry. And if it's too dry, you can add some water. No problem about that. About the bread, here you can see the picture that we have in this compost bucket. We have bread. So in that case, you can add bread to the compost pile, but make sure that it's not like the bread after eating your sandwich, or nothing with fat or with any other spices or something not natural, not something that can affect our compost pile or even attract more animals. And for the vermiculture, that is composting with worms, so we can be composting without them and perfectly have a good compost. You don't need worms. But when you are doing it with worms, so in that case, you need to be very careful about temperature. 55 to 77 Fahrenheit. Uh, so this, especially, it's an indoor location or some location that you can keep that temperature, because when it's too cold, unless you have some good insulation, the poor worms, they are gonna suffer. So in that case, they are a little more picky about the conditions. So they need some well ventilated area. You need to be focused on the moisture control, the temperature. So it's possible to keep them going during the winter, especially for big compost beds. So in that case, the temperature is easier to control, and still keep composting and getting your compost every 2 to 3 months. This one, you need to learn more about that one. So here in this QR code, or just searching, Cornell University has the Cornell vermicompost website, and you can be reading and learning about this particular method. So remember just to use your current compost before starting the new pile. And you can start taking care of your compost, about not allowing the compost to be frozen, and keeping the good balance between greens and browns, to keep that heat inside, protecting your compost bin or pile. And learning, that's the best way that we can keep learning and reading and reading. The Cornell Cooperative Extension Allegany County has a compost section in our website, or just from Cornell University, the composting and food waste. So just Cornell University, composting and food waste. You can read more all the material that they have, or just scanning this QR code here. And we have 5 minutes if there are any questions that you have right now. We have a couple minutes left. Any questions? No? Okay. Yeah, sometimes we are like, no, it's all clear. So everything is good. But if you remember any question and you want to ask anytime, so you can send me an email to this one, an email or contacting Cornell Cooperative Extension, Allegany County, and the group of educators, master gardeners. We are always there to help you. Um, and even if we don't know the answer, we know the experts to ask them and them getting that answer. And that will be it for now. So I think this is our last online session for the year. Thank you for being here. Um, I hope these classes they are helpful for all of you. And next month we're gonna have a series, a video series about growing herbs indoors. So stay tuned to the Cooperative Extension Allegany County website because we're gonna be posting that one. Also our YouTube channel. And that will be it. Uh, we are grateful to be here, grateful to be learning. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks, Cristian.
Yes,
Thank you.
you're welcome. Let's
See you
stop.
soon.